Tamu morning show.
Oh! Young, no more!
The fort is breached and the wagons are burning.
Why doesn't the Prime Minister just say the truth and tell the indigenous peoples that he doesn't give a about their rights?
Free winter culture. We want to free Palestine.
It's a good day to be indigenous.
KREZ 1680 AM.
Sangitamu Turtle Island, welcome to the TRN KREZ 1680 AM morning show. Today we are continuing the celebration of 10 years of the Red Nation by going back to the beginning and highlighting speeches and clips from our archives. We hope you enjoy this mixtape, and if you do, please consider empowering Red Media. We still have links to our GoFundMe in our bio, and if you can also join the Patreon where you will find exclusive benefits and bonus content. Thank you to all of our supporters of the show, and we hope you enjoy the mixtape, comrades.
Sorry, so you want to go me? Was I next? Sorry. I'm so incensed and pissed off about those testimonies that were just shared that I wanted to come up here immediately and talk about it. So again, my name is Melanie Yazzie. I'm a PhD student in American Studies here at UNM. I'm also one of the founders of the Red Nation, the organization, we're not an organization, we're a collective, Indigenous-led collective here in Albuquerque that's been active for the last few months. Can everybody hear me?
Yes.
Okay. I want to thank ABQ Justice for inviting me here to talk about police violence. On the program, I'm listed as talking about police violence against oppressed populations, poor populations, and poor populations of color. I'm just going to focus on Native violence because that's my specialty. And also, we live in Albuquerque, and as these testimonies, I think 2 or 3 of the folks who were interviewed and what was just shared talk about Albuquerque as Indigenous space. We are on Indigenous land, the history of colonialism here. The word colonialism needs to be used more when we talk about police violence in Albuquerque, and so we need to acknowledge that. I mean, we have several pueblos that continue to live and surround and constrain the ability of the city to grow, for example. There's a strong Indigenous presence. There are 291 Indigenous nations represented in the population of Albuquerque. If you didn't know that, that's massive. There are 55,000 Native people who live in Albuquerque, 35,000 of which come from my nation, the Navajo Nation. So I think that a focus on Native issues, specifically in the context of Albuquerque, is absolutely essential when we're talking about issues of police violence. I want to advance an identity, a political identity I have. I'm an enrolled member of the Navajo Nation. I don't say that very often because I don't think that the law is very helpful. I think the law is primarily violent in the way that it interacts with Native people. I mean, we're talking about the police, right, who are like the enforcers of violence primarily in the United States here at this tribunal. But the reason why I'm saying I'm an enrolled member of the Navajo Nation, and that's what who and how I represent myself today at this tribunal, is because that identity is vested in treaties. It's vested in the idea and the fact that Native people belong to the nations, and these nations threaten the legitimacy of the United States, all of its institutions, and the citizens who claim patriotic duty and affiliation with the nation-state of the United States. Because the United States was founded originally and primarily, along with slavery, under sort of forced servitude, but at its foundational moment, the so-called discovery of the Americas was a colonial act. The expansion of capitalism into the Americas was about killing Native people. It was about stealing by force, Native land, and it continues to be a fundamental structuring element of how the United States relates with Indigenous people. And the way that that relates to treaties is that treaties are violated constantly by the government, by its institutions, and by citizens. Treaties are violated. The status of Indigenous nations as political entities that have political power and legitimacy is constantly domesticated, it's privatized, it's ignored, it's denied, and this has everything to do with the system of violence and the extreme system of violence that Native people continue to face all over the so-called United States, but definitely in a place like Albuquerque. And so when I call myself an enrolled member of the Navajo Nation, I'm invoking the treaty status of the Navajo Nation. I'm invoking the Navajo Nation as an actual Indigenous nation that has political power. 35,000 of my fellow citizens, Navajo citizens, reside in Albuquerque. 10% of Albuquerque's population is Navajo, is my understanding. And so this is a Navajo space as much as it is any other space. And that's why I'm here. So I wanted to give some statistics, some of which I think have already been given by previous speakers and then by the speaker before me with this testimony, but just to give you a sense of not just the disproportionate violence that Native people, not just in Albuquerque, but in the so-called United States experience, but the catastrophic catastrophic level of violence, right? Disproportionate is not as serious as the word catastrophic or the level of crisis that Native people experience. So just to give you a sense of statistics, 78% of Native people don't live on reservations or trust lands in the United States. 78% of people, that means people living in Albuquerque, regardless of the fact that they're related to nation states, right? They live here in Albuquerque. So we have 55,000 Native people, 219 indigenous nations represented in Albuquerque. Along with African Americans, I'm not sure where the statistic lies because I'm bad at statistics, but Native people overall are the poorest demographic of people in the so-called United States. We experience twice the rate of violence, and when I talk about violence, I'm talking about police violence, sexual and gender violence, suicide, substance abuse, untreated mental health, right? All of these indicators of violence that come from poverty and also from colonialism, which I'll talk about here in a second, or in a minute. We experience 45% unemployment rates in states like South Dakota, New Mexico, and Arizona. It's not a coincidence that there are large Lakota and Dakota land bases and large challenges to the legitimacy of the way that land and private property are run in these locations by Navajo people and Lakota and Dakota people. Native people, as was said earlier, experience incarceration higher than any other group in the United States. Native children experience post-traumatic stress disorder at the rate of veterans returning from Iraq and Afghanistan. From 1977 to 2013, the Native prison population in the so-called United States increased by 500%, along with many other populations. 13% of the homeless population in Albuquerque is Native. And in terms of healthcare, right, is the indicator of life. It's the indicator of well-being and longevity, right? So it's also an indicator of how violence impacts and impedes that. In the state of New Mexico, $2,849 is spent on Native healthcare per capita on each individual by the Indian Health Service. Meanwhile, the national average in the United States is $8,895 for a normal U.S. citizen, and in the state of New Mexico, it's $7,315 per inmate in New Mexico correctional institutions. And it was found that the Native urban population in New Mexico, i.e. primarily the population in Albuquerque, has the worst health care of any population in the entire United States. And so that really tells you about the situation of violence and the extreme and catastrophic context of violence that Native people in Albuquerque experience. And in terms of police treatment of Native people, I only have a few minutes left. It's really characterized by intimidation, extreme brutality, and this concept of an extrajudicial system. This is something the chair of my department kind of incorporated or talked to us about when we started to do the work on border town violence here in American Studies at UNM. And this idea of an extrajudicial system is really one in which sort of the common sense of colonialism, which is a common sense of anti-Indianism, it's a common sense that Native people must be disappeared constantly because we're attached to political entities that really fundamentally challenge the system of U.S. supremacy, of U.S. sovereignty, of U.S. domination, right? The very existence of the United States. That there's extrajudicial killing, that the police, even though they're part of the judicial system in the United States, that the police really enforce on the streets in a place like Albuquerque, and I'll describe how this happens, and I think you heard this in some of the testimony that was given right before I came up here. It's arbitrary, it's nebulous, it happens on the streets, it doesn't happen in institutions. It happens in back alleyways at night, it happens outside of the purview of the law. And the police and citizens both enforce this in Albuquerque. When we think about the killings of Cowboy and Rabbit, Allison Gorman and Keith Thompson, two Navajo men who were brutally bludgeoned to death beyond the point of recognition, it was last July here in Albuquerque. What we're talking about is extrajudicial violence. And the fact that it doesn't happen within the purview of institutions, the fact that it happens all the time, creates a climate of fear and a climate of violence, where Native people in Albuquerque, much like what you just heard in that testimony, always have to be wary of violence coming from absolutely every direction, not just the cops in Albuquerque, right? And so it's this system, the colonialism creates this system, in which if the common sense of the citizenship and of the state and its institutions and its primary arbiters and enforcers like the police force, if the system is premised on the disappearance and the killability, right, and the invisibility of Native people because we threaten the legitimacy of the system, the fundamental legitimacy of the system itself, then you understand why those levels of violence are so high, why they happen everywhere all the time. They can be spontaneous, instantaneous, and it's because they're structural, that they exist in such extreme forms. A Native person has to be disappeared, their presence has to be eradicated, right, in order for that legitimacy to constantly constantly be reinforced and to constantly be reinscribed. Native people are seen as a threat, especially in a place like Albuquerque, where we're entirely surrounded by treaty lands, by indigenous nations, where 10% of our population is comprised of the largest indigenous nation in the so-called United States, right? And so this idea of containment, this common sense of containment, this common sense of extreme violence against Native people, that helps us to explain why that exists in such a profound way in a place like Albuquerque. And just to close, there are also statistics and there are also reports that talk about the way that police, and right, this is part of the militarization of different sectors, so-called public sectors or service sectors in the United States. The way that police have in locations with large urban locations with large Native American populations, how the police have been increasingly expected to perform the role of service providers, whether it's to mediate domestic violence services, family violence, mental illness or mental health issues, issues of sexual and gender violence, etc. And part of this is the confluence of the state, the colonial state, using police to violate treaties, because those services are actually premised on treaties. If you ever look up the history of treaties, we have 291, because we have 291 indigenous nations represented in Albuquerque. You have 291 treaties that are constantly violated, that are never enforced, that are completely ignored, and those treaties have written in them the funds and the services that are supposed to be provided to Native populations. So why in the hell do Native people in a place like Albuquerque have the worst health care of any other population in the country? It's because of colonialism, it's because of anti-Indian common sense. And the Red Nation is trying to work on these issues. We're trying to mobilize and work with both Native populations, particularly urban populations. And we're excited to be involved in this process and to collaborate with other people. And we also ask that you understand our issues and that we all work together to help poor Native people in this city stop dying, because they die every day. And we're holding a similar event to this in Gallup on April 4th. I can tell you more about it if you want, to recognize the 176 Native, primarily Navajo people who have died unnatural and brutal deaths there, much in the same way that all of these people on this wall have here in Albuquerque.
Ready?
Yep, whenever you're ready.
Got A. Jennifer Danae.
Yat A, Leola Cowboy Inishia.
Yat A, my name is Melanie Yazi. I'm one of the co-founders of the Red Nation.
Aloha, Velina Mai Kako, Kavika Maile, Vau.
My name is Sam Gordapi, and I am a Pawnee second from
My name is David Maile.
I'm a Lakota
Chana,
from
and the Lower Bruce.
Hi, my name is Nick Estes, and I'm a co-founder with the Red Nation.
I am Stella, a Danette transgender woman, a human being wondering why this place is so harmful, why continual violence is being committed toward my homeless relatives and lesbian, gay, bi, and transgender family. I'm here because we need immediate change. We need accountability. I'm here because I'm a product of this town and this county. My grandmother instilled in her, as she has instilled in me, that we are all human beings. We cannot look away anymore and dismiss our suffering relatives. We cannot look away from our own broken selves. It is not our fault, but we can change it. In this past year, gates were built to separate our homeless relatives in a place that makes them the problem. Many of our homeless relatives walk hours on end, hungry and broken, while its city officials wonder why the hell we are the way we are and how to resolve us, the problem. We are the condition of racism. So many years have passed and we are still being exterminated. Over 170 Native relatives have died unnaturally in the past 3 years, and liquor still saturates these streets. It is no longer an Indian problem, it's a people problem.
I'm pleased to be a part of the Red Nations. I'm very appreciative and encouraged by our young people's care and interest in the Indigenous people's issues and concerns that expand from the past to the present. I take on the concerns of my ancestors and the cares of my ancestors when I also use or be a part of Red Nations to address the ongoing violence that is Gallup, New Mexico. As a member of Red Nations, we are demanding justice for the Indigenous and Navajo people who come into Gallup, who live in Gallup, and who are treated with incredible violence and discriminated against, and where racism is rampant.
I was speaking to somebody today, and I said, well, 180 people have passed away since July 2013. And he said, wow, I thought you were going to say since like 1975 that 180 people had passed away. And the fact that that has transpired in less than 24 months, and those are all Native people who died in Gallup, means that the conditions of life for Native people off reservation, and this is the population we primarily deal with in Albuquerque and Gallup, is incredibly violent, and it's catastrophic.
There's a political vacuum existing in off-reservation Native populations because nobody is speaking to their issues. Those issues include anything from healthcare to rampant criminalization and harassment and by the police or law enforcement. It could include lack of adequate education. It could include lack of social services, or it could include anything from finding a job or a decent place to live or a home.
I got involved with the Red Nation because, number one, I like the concept. Number two, it was because there was no political activity in this area to help our people. Natives were dying and were being murdered on the street, homeless natives. We have a very large Native population in this part of the country, but not a whole lot of activism, not a whole lot of issues are being addressed.
While my brothers and sisters lie on the side of the street, in the ditches, cold, hungry, forgotten. You're not forgotten. We're here for you.
I'm originally from Tuolagay, New Mexico. Last year, the convenience store there tried to open a liquor establishment, but with the help of citizens like yourself, Jennifer Denedale, that shit was shut down. Yeah. That is the power of this group here. Look at all these yellow signs, these tombstones of recognition that the city of Gallup has produced. Our relatives are being bullied into shame and silence, herded around the city like sheep, and simply forgotten. The city of Gallup needs to be accountable starting today. Our loved ones who have passed this winter will never see another blossoming spring, another birthday, or simply be loved. We walk and stand here in solidarity for them. They will never be forgotten. We are here to make sure the city of Gallup doesn't either.
This isn't a new problem. This isn't anything new. And the Red Nation isn't doing anything new either. We're actually continuing 500 years of resistance. The city of Gallup, it makes money off of the land and life of Native people. This city preys on Native people, and we're treated like nothing in our own land. These are actually a continuation of colonialism. Colonialism is not over. The city of Gallup is creating acts of war on Native people. The U.S. government is creating acts of war. They are systemically killing us one by one, and we're not going to take it anymore. And that's why we're here. That's why we're standing up. And that's what we're going to do. Thanks.
We are centered on building a broad-based movement that centers Indigenous issues and placing Indigenous issues and Native issues at the forefront of struggle rather than an afterthought, which often Native people are if they're considered at all.
And we really try to orientate ourselves and hopefully this movement that we're trying to build around this sort of like strident politics that's rooted in sort of the Indigenous critique of colonialism and capitalism. And again, I don't see really any other group that is really doing that, Indigenous-led or not, at least in the so-called United States. So
I've been working with the Red Nation collectively on solidarity statements against the 30-meter telescope project that is infringing upon Hawaiians or Kanaka Maoli's sacred mountain Mauna a Wakea or Mauna Kea. And in doing so, working with other organizations around the world and activists to take a stand in solidarity against this type of colonial but also capitalist kind of violence against Native peoples and our lands.
One of the most important things about Red Nation is the action, is the movement, is the appearance, is being there. And that's what I'm about. I don't know any other way to be in an organization. I've never been taught how to be a human, how to be a woman, how to be a wife, how to be a mother. No one's ever taught me how to be an activist. So the only thing I know how to do is show up and speak who I am and what I'm fighting for every day. And that's for this land. I want it back. I don't know what that looks like, but I would love to see how we're going to dismantle this. I'm excited. Let's do it.
Be it proclaimed that the council, the governing body of the city of Albuquerque, hereby recognizes the second Monday of October as Indigenous Peoples Day. Mr. Estes.
Thank you, President Garduño. Albuquerque is the largest city in the state of New Mexico with the highest concentration of Native people living in it. And for President Garduño and the council to consider this proclamation means a lot to this community, a community that is continuously marginalized and erased, not just within this city, but in the state as well. And by adopting this proclamation, the city of Albuquerque will join many cities across the nation, two actually today, that have adopted Indigenous Peoples Day, and that's Portland and Lawrence, Kansas. So it's also part of an international movement, as is described in this particular proclamation that began in 1977 with the inauguration of Indigenous Peoples Act. And currently, in the last 4 decades, that particular movement at the United Nations for Indigenous Peoples has addressed the issue of Indigenous Peoples Day in particular, and what does it mean for the world to recognize Indigenous peoples, and to begin telling the stories, the historic stories of contribution that Native people have made to the world, but also the contributions that Indigenous peoples have strived to achieve and are still striving to achieve. And so with this proclamation, it demonstrates a progressive step for Albuquerque, the city of Albuquerque, to begin humanizing Native people by honoring us on this historic day, a day that has been set aside by the United Nations, but has also been set aside by countless number of tribal nations across the Western Hemisphere. And so by adopting this proclamation, you will be honoring that commitment to Indigenous human rights and to the recognition of Indigenous peoples that currently call Albuquerque home. And so with that, I just want to conclude by saying that adopting the Indigenous Peoples Day as a formal day, the second holiday, or second Monday of October, is not going to end some of the marginalization that we experience as a community in the city or in the state, but it will be a progressive step forward for this city to begin thinking about and addressing histories that don't often get talked about, and voices, particularly Indigenous voices in this community, that often are marginalized. And so if by adopting this proclamation, we invite you, the City Council, to join us on October 12th, which is this coming Monday, for an Indigenous Peoples Day March that's going to be happening in the city. And it's booked to be the largest Indigenous Peoples Day March in the region, but also one of the largest gatherings of Native people in this city's recent history. And so I ask you to join us in making history. We recognize that Indigenous Peoples Day is not a parochial holiday. It's not just about Indigenous peoples. It's about talking and sharing. It's about talking about our shared history on this land. And so with that, I invite you to endorse this proclamation. The community that stands behind me right now, they're people who make your food, we teach your kids, we protect your kids. We work here in Albuquerque, we call Albuquerque home. And this is a proclamation that really came out of the local Native community here in Albuquerque, which, by the way, there are 291 federally recognized tribes that live in Albuquerque that currently call Albuquerque home. And so that's why we chose Indigenous Peoples Day, to represent the diversity of Native people in this city. So with that, again, I ask you to join us in making history, and in making history not just for this region and this city, but also making history with the rest of the world. Thank you.
All right, good afternoon. My name is Melanie. I'm an assistant professor of Native American Studies and American Studies at the University of New Mexico here in Albuquerque. I'm also the 2019-2020 Culture Desk for the Red Nation. I also co-founded the Red Nation. These are my comrades right here. So I'd first like to thank Samia Asas for inviting me to speak here today. As some of you may know, Samia is on the board of directors for the National Women's March. She is also a Palestinian woman. It's no coincidence that a Palestinian woman invited a Diné woman, me, to speak here today. Palestinians and the indigenous people of Turtle Island have much in common. Our struggles for liberation and decolonization are premised on the same thing, the right of return. The return of Palestinians to their rightful homelands, now under occupation by Israel, and the return of indigenous homelands to indigenous nations, now under occupation by the United States. You may be wondering why I, as a Diné indigenous woman, am starting my remarks by talking about Palestine. As I said above, Palestinians and indigenous people here have much in common. Our shared struggle is about the land. We struggle so that we may caretake the land and be in right relation with the land. In order to do this, we must have self-determination. Not the fictitious self-determination granted to us by colonial states, but true self-determination. From the plunder and poison states facilitate in the name of global capitalism and world domination. Israel has stolen Palestinian land to produce some of the world's deadliest military technology, which is today being used to crush the mass movement that erupted last month in response to Modi's anti-Muslim citizenship law in India, and here in New Mexico, where the United States stole Tiwa, Tewa, Diné, and Ende lands to produce the nuclear bomb and install touchstones of the U.S. military-industrial complex like Intel, Sandia National Labs, and Kirtland Air Force Base. Our lands, indigenous lands, Palestinian lands, are point zero for the death machine of war, imperialism, colonialism, and capitalism. So what does this have to do with feminism and the Women's March? The liberation of Palestine and Turtle Island are at the heart of all of our efforts to turn the tide of history. In a moment where our collective destiny, indeed our struggle for our very life and future, hinges on our ability to make connections between these seemingly separate issues, we must acknowledge that feminism is one of the best tools we have to forge the relationships necessary for building powerful mass movements that can encompass many demands and many people. Queer indigenous feminists, of which I am one, have long understood that we are stronger when we are growing in numbers and caretaking one another. As famed Dakota intellectual Ella Deloria once said, "I am not afraid, I have relatives." To be a good relative in this historical moment means to fight back, to fight for the right of Palestinian and indigenous return to land, to fight for an end to U.S. imperialism in all wars, to fight for land and a world beyond capitalism. On this day and always, we fight for all of this in the name of feminism.
We share that same spirit. As the planet burns, we are truly what Frantz Fanon called the wretched of the earth. Corporations want to privatize and make scarce, precious resources while making this world uninhabitable in the name of profit. For our Apache relatives at Oak Flat stand against privatization and wanton destruction of their sacred site. The Diné, Dobenitzio fight against the corporate pollution and reallocation of precious water resources. When our homelands are no longer inhabitable, we move to places like Gallup, Farmington, and Albuquerque. In these border towns, we encounter violence and discrimination while they steal our precious resources and exploit our relatives, reducing us to paupers in our own homelands. Indigenous peoples in the U.S. are the most incarcerated population in the world. In places like South Dakota, prison populations have increased more than 500% since 1976. Most are Lakota brothers and sisters, like our relative Leonard Peltier. Mass incarceration was used as a tool to silence our political leadership. Now it is used to eliminate populations by removing us from our own homelands. We must ask, how can the U.S. affirm democracy abroad when it is still denied to Indigenous peoples? We Indigenous peoples... are the constant reminder of that hypocrisy. And we refuse to go away. We refuse to be silent. And we refuse to disappear. That's the Indigenous spirit Leonard Peltier embodies after 4 decades of incarceration. And it is time that spirit is set free. Leonard Peltier was a revolutionary. You are a revolutionary. Come on now. Say it. I am a revolutionary.
Racism against Native people and other people of color in this state. They're not going to find Austin Shipley guilty. We need the Navajo Nation to exert its sovereignty and its power and authority to stand on behalf of the family of L'Oreal, and the Navajo people of Winslow. We demand that the federal government, the Department of Justice, come in here and conduct an independent investigation. The report on what happened to her body, you know what that report said? It said it was a homicide. It did. It said it was a homicide. And yet the Maricopa County Attorney's Office says that Austin Shipley didn't do anything wrong. You know what that report said? It said it was a homicide. It did. It said it was a homicide. And yet the Maricopa County Attorney's Office says that Austin Shipley didn't do anything wrong. He had the full weight of the state. He was armed to the hilt in that situation. L'Oreal was just a young woman walking down the street. He advanced upon her from behind and he attacked her. That is exactly what happened. And she fought back to defend herself, to demand her dignity and her humanity. And we are here today in her spirit and in her actions to demand dignity for her because she can no longer speak. We're here to demand dignity for all Native and Dene women and for all of our Native relatives who face this kind of fucking brutality every day. Other people, this kind of racism and brutality, and we're not standing for it anymore. That's why the Red Nation came into existence 2 years ago. It was because we wanted to advocate with our communities and stand up for our people. Because this shit goes on, it goes on every day. L'Oreal is not exceptional. Our relatives, there are relatives who were murdered in Flagstaff by the Flagstaff police not too long ago. We have a relative who was shot by police in Gallup just last week, wasn't it? This happens every day. And the fact that it happens every day means that it's okay. The message that sends that it's okay to violate and to murder our relatives. It's not okay. This is our land. We belong here. The spirits of this land recognizes us as B'la'ashlai, the five-fingered ones. We come from this place. And we will reclaim this place as our own and be human and have the dignity that we deserve in our own homelands. And so today, we're demanding that Austin Shipley go to jail. Because if he doesn't go to jail, he has a long track record. He has a long track record of abusing people. And you know what? This police department never did anything about it. This murder of L'Oreal could have been prevented. Since 2013, how many of over a dozen infractions that he's committed? Brutalizing people in custody, tasing 15-year-old girls from behind, lying, tampering with evidence. He has done all of that, and none of it. He was never taken off the force for any of it. He was even the police corporal who did his exam when he entered the police force even recommended that he should not be a police officer because he was so unethical and enjoyed using excessive force. That is Austin Shipley. He's a pig, he's a murderer, and if he doesn't go behind bars, he will do this again. And I don't want this to happen to any more of our relatives. I don't want any more families having to go through the pain and the grief that your family has gone through. And that's why we're here. We have 10 demands. You can go to the Facebook page for this event, but that's why we're here. And we're not gonna stop coming, Winslow, until you actually do what we tell you to do. This is people's justice on behalf of the Ned people. Thank you for hearing me.